Welcome, students. We're going to take some notes on the Vietnam War. Let's begin. The major parts that you need to write down are what is underlined. Don't feel like you have to write everything down unless that will help you. The purpose of the war is to prevent the spread of communism. Because remember that Russia had become a communist state during World War I, and then before World War II, Russia um, continued that communism. Then after World War II, China became communistic, and so this is to prevent the spread of communism to other regions. The U.S. involvement is going to span 30 years. That would be good to know. Major troop involvement will begin in 1965, however, but this involvement will span 6 presidents from Truman to Ford, but it's really in the 1960s that we have major involvement. Background, you don't need to write down everything, just what is underlined. Vietnam, in the 1800s, the French had controlled Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And so we get involved after World War II to help the French out because we have an alliance with the French. So we feel this political connection to help them in this region. So Truman sends financial aid, but France eventually backs out when they lose control of Vietnam. And so we could have had the opportunity to also back out and to be non-involved. But because we had so much financial aid already in this area, we felt like we could succeed where the French had lost. And maybe that's the American pride at work, that we think that we can win where others have lost, whether it's in Afghanistan or as you see here in Vietnam. But this was a war that was doomed from the beginning. You'll have two sides and two leaders. You'll have the South versus the North. You'll have Nong Den Diem, who will be the president of the South. He was Catholic, very unpopular, and will be overthrown in 1963. In the North, you have Ho Chi Minh. He's the voice of freedom, widely supported leader throughout the war. He would be communistic. And so Ho Chi Minh actually asks America for help against the French. And we have the opportunity to help the northern leader. However, we would end up siding with the French instead, which would seal the fate of the Vietnam War. What's most important to know about Nong Dan Diem is that he was anti-communist but unpopular. He was a Catholic in a Buddhist nation. And so because he was Catholic, we felt like he was a good ally to the United States, but in reality, he was out of touch with the people. And that's really the legacy of the Vietnam War, is that America is never able to win the hearts and the minds of the Vietnamese people. And really tragic. The communist opposition would be the Viet Cong. They're a rebel group in the South. They tried to overthrow Diem. Buddhist monks would set themselves on fire in protest of Diem. And there's some pretty famous pictures there of the Buddhists lighting themselves on fire while they are meditating in protest of Diem. Really bad situation, and we are definitely on the wrong side of history as Americans. There's the introduction of domino theory. Domino theory is a term that you need to know, a vocab term. As you can see in the picture below, there's this feeling that if Vietnam falls to communism, so will Laos, so will Cambodia, and you might say, big deal about those. Well, then Thailand does. Thailand's pretty important, and so is India. And so if Thailand and India fall to communism, that is a big deal because those are industrial centers. And so you might say to yourself, oh, who cares about Vietnam? It's such a small country. Just let them be and let them be communists if they wish. But there's this feeling of domino theory, that if one country falls to communism, all will fall. The Vietnamese didn't believe that. They just wanted to be independent, and they felt like America was the aggressor. The Vietnamese didn't even know they were communist, most of them. Most of the Vietnamese just were fighting for their own farms, their own homeland, and so when they see aggressors, they don't know about this larger Vietnam War. They just know that aggressors from another country are invading their property. The French would lose Vietnam, and the Geneva Accords would be signed in 1954. This would give independence to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This would divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel between a North and South Vietnam. This Geneva Accords also agreed to elections in 1956 to reunify the country. So the country was in 1954 divided at the 17th parallel with hopes in 2 years to reunify the country with a democratic election. However, Nong Don Diem refused to participate, which is really ironic, really sad. The man that supported anti-communism, the man who was supposed to be democratic, who was American supported, is the man who is not going to allow an election. And so he refused to participate in this election, and that would seal the fate of the Vietnam War. Eisenhower's role would be to add money and advisors to the South. So Truman only added money. Eisenhower will add money and advisors, and then Kennedy will add actual troops to the ground. So JFK's role, as I mentioned, is to send in special forces. He sends in the Green Berets in 1961. The Green Berets are to advise the South on how to fight communist forces. There's 15,000 advisors by 1963, and Diem, the president of the South, would be overthrown. Actually, he would be assassinated by the United States because we start to realize that he is not to be trusted, that he's unpopular, and so we try to establish a different leader that would be pro-U.S. in the South, but the Vietnam War just escalates and becomes more and more of a disaster. Johnson takes command. Two important terms you need to know is Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and Operation Rolling Thunder. So it is reported on August 2nd, 1964, that one of our ships, the USS Maddox, is attacked. It's disputable today if they were actually attacked. It could have just been a hoax. However, this leads to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution because we feel like if the North is attacking one of our ships, even though that ship shouldn't be in their waters, that's a direct threat to the United States. And so Lyndon Baines Johnson is told, tells the troops and General William Westmoreland to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression. And so we aggress to keep from further aggression, which is kind of ironic. The escalation and the Americanization of the war, 1965 is really when we take over in the war. We conduct something called Operation Rolling Thunder, which is first sustained bombing campaign against the North, and this would be a huge failure. We will send 180,000 troops to fight in Vietnam. And this Operation Rolling Thunder, we thought that we could just simply bomb the North and win, but we don't realize that it's not that easy because there's really no central location to bomb. So we just start bombing the jungle where all the helpless farmers are, thinking that we can bomb them into submission, but that doesn't work. Escalation. There's a lot of information here, but the end is the most important part that's underlined that you need to know. LBJ is going to be advised by William Westmoreland and also McNamara. They're going to advise to increase troop numbers. They believe that if we just have more troops in Vietnam, we will win. We don't realize that Vietnam is an unwinnable war. From 65 to 73, U.S. dropped more than 6 million tons of bombs. That is catastrophic. This is one of the saddest wars that we've ever been involved in, where we are bombing families and children and innocent civilians, thinking that we're bombing the enemy. We drop napalm, which is a jellied gasoline, and we also spray Agent Orange all over the jungle. Agent Orange would actually be created at Berkeley University in Northern California, and that's why a lot of protests will happen at Berkeley University. as a result of this Agent Orange and trying to keep Berkeley Science Department from producing it. Airstrikes and search and destroy missions were common. Northern strategy is tiger versus elephant. The North is the tiger, and we're the elephant. So we feel like if we just slowball this, that we'll eventually win.
It's dawn, and Alpha 219 is commuting to war. 21 GIs bound for a jungle clearing a mile from the Cambodian border.
All right, so problems. The Viet Cong guerrilla warfare was difficult to fight. It becomes a war of attrition where it's just outlasting the other side. There's really no clear objectives. That's a war of attrition. Beat the other side into submission is the idea. Unstoppable South Vietnamese government. Morale was sinking fast by the late 1960s at home and abroad. The number of draftees starts to increase. The main things you need to know is that there's difficult conditions in Vietnam that causes us to lose in Vietnam. Also, the damaging to the U.S. economy. We have domestic goals that we want to work on in America, but those come in conflict with the Vietnam War. And so it makes this war very unpopular. There's growing credibility gap, division at home. And that last part is possibly the biggest reason is that there's this growing lack of trust, and that the loss of the war at home really keeps us from winning the war abroad. However, this is definitely an unwinnable war no matter what the problems are. Tet Offensive in 1968. We felt like we were winning the war for 4 years, from 64 to early 68, but really in early 1968, during the Lunar New Year, the North Vietnamese the Viet Cong, will stage attacks in multiple different cities. I believe it's around 100 different cities that will be attacked at the same time. And though the U.S. forces are able to beat them back, this really showed that the Vietnamese were a force to fight with, that the Viet Cong was a force to fight with. So this lowers U.S. morale, which is hope, in winning the war. So the Tet Offensive would be not a strategic victory for the North, but would definitely be a moral victory for them. 1968 is known as the year of turmoil, which some people are saying draws close association with 2020. Police are going to clash with protesters at the Democratic National Convention. That's because the Democrats will not know who should be their running mate or who should be their presidential candidate in the 1968 election, because the Democrats had chosen Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother. However, he would be killed by Sirhan during the primaries. And so you will have anti-Vietnam War demonstrators that will be protesting against pro-war Democrats, and it'll cause a lot of protests, and cops will have to be called in to put down this protest at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So the candidates will be Republican Nixon versus Democrats Humphrey. And as you know, in history, the Republicans would win with Nixon, who used to be Eisenhower's vice president. As you can see right here, the popular vote was quite close. However, the electoral vote, Nixon is able to win the states fairly there. As you can see in the South, most were voting for Wallace, who was somewhat of a racist in the South, and he would run as the American Independent. Now you're wondering, why isn't Johnson running for president in 1968 like he could have? He had promised not to seek election in 1968, mainly due to the Tet Offensive. It just showed that he was not winning the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War definitely cost Johnson his presidency. He could have run a second term, However, he loses, or he is the first president to not seek a new term. Nixon takes control. Nixon vows to end the war with this Peace with Honor campaign. He does not want to just simply back troops out of Vietnam, though he wants to do that. He wants to make sure that we have honor in doing it. So, must deal with divided country. So, Nixon, he is both going to withdraw us from Vietnam, but at the same time also expand the Vietnam War. So, this Vietnamization is the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops and train the South to fight instead. This realpolitik is the practical approach of foreign approach, and detente is the easing of tensions with the USSR. So Richard Nixon, we'll look at in another section, is one of America's best foreign policy presidents that we've ever had because he's able to play countries against one another. Donald Trump is using much of a Nixon card today, where he's trying to do the same thing with Russia and North Korea and China. Nixon is going to do this Vietnamization, and it's actually going to work, where we do withdraw U.S. troops, but at the same time, unfortunately, he does expand the war into Cambodia and Laos in order to withdraw those U.S. troops. Thank you for taking these notes, and make sure to upload them to Google Classroom.